All right, we're at 12:01, so I'll go ahead and introduce myself and give some housekeeping items. I'm going to keep this very short because we've got some, folks who are going to be doing the talking today, and they're more exciting than I am. So my name is Matt Frentz. I am an assistant director here for our Affinity and Domestic Engagement Team, Office of Alumni Relations at the wonderful Northeastern University. I joined our team September 1st, and I'm very excited to be a part of this team and to be putting on events such as this one and working with fantastic alums. So let's go over a few notes just as we do for some Zoom things. It's been 18 months of this for a lot of us, so we know kind of Zoom manners, but here are some just notes for today's presentation. So just please stay muted throughout the presentation. If you do have questions, you can go ahead and drop those to me in the chat box, and those will get relayed to Jack as he kind of presents, but he'll be sharing his screen and you'll be able to see things. And then we'll be able to get to some of those questions at the end as well. So just make use of that chat box. If you do have any questions, don't hop in and start talking. We'll do that differently today. I'll be managing it. So if you have any other questions or even technical difficulties, you can message me directly in the chat box as well. Also, just wanted to make a note that automated transcription services are available during this event. So you can hide and show the subtitles or the live transcription with the closed caption button in the bottom toolbar, which is a nice tool. So make sure that we use as that. So those are the kind of housekeeping things. Today's event is exciting because it's a collaborative effort. We've got our Cape Cod community as well as our NU at Noon program committee coming together today for this event. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Joe Hunt from NU at Noon to introduce our speaker. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, thank you, Matt. And as Matt mentioned, we're really happy to have this a collaborative hosting event between the Cape Cod community and the Northeastern at Noon committee. And as you're probably aware, today's presentation is Cool Cars, High Art, a History of Car Custom Culture. Now, I'm sure each of us here today has owned several cars, and in general, we've been relatively satisfied with their styling and performance. But back in the mid-1940s, some owners customized their cars to better display their own distinctive personalities, craftsmanship skills, and artistic talents. Others became motorheads and modified their production models' appearance and performance into uniquely styled hot rods. In any case, regardless of whether you've been involved in any of these activities or not, I'm sure you're all aware of this exuberant subculture. Our speaker today, Jack DeWitt, has been closely associated with this subculture. He graduated from Northeastern in 1966 with an AB degree. He then went on to earn a PhD degree in English from the University of Connecticut. Then for 40 years, he taught and held administrative posts at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia. In fact, he's been honored as a professor emeritus there. He's a published author of both fiction, the Varian Pike Detective Series, and poetry, 4 books plus selections in various publications. He's a member of the Street Rodders Hall of Fame, and his book, Cool Cars, High Art, The Rise of Kustom Kulture, was a Street Rodder Hall of Fame selection. He's personally customized, nosed, decked, and lowered his own metallic blue 1953 Chevy. So Jack has been associated with this cool car culture for many years, and based on his own experience, he will acquaint us with the history of this subculture during its golden age, from the mid-1940s to the 1960s. So with that, I now turn this session over to our presenter, Jack DeWitt. Welcome, Jack.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Joe, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you to Northeastern for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here and to take part in this collaborative event and to share with the audience some aspects of the history of custom culture. So let me begin with a very bad joke, but it's one of the oldest jokes I've heard in terms of car racing, and that is, when was the first automobile race? And the answer is when the second car was built. And there's no doubt that cars were being modified as far back as the turn of the century, and there was all sorts of racing taking place for decades on tracks, in circles, up hills, across deserts. But my focus is on a very particular group of car fanatics it has a long and fairly complicated history that continues to this day. I'm going to concentrate on just one, as Joe mentioned, one single chapter of that history, a golden age that lasted for 2 decades, almost 2 decades, from 46 to 63. So here's a brief take on custom culture. And my slides aren't working.
Fix it.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. I'm
sorry, I should have said shift. You're in second. You need to go into third.
Yeah.
Could you try clicking the arrow in the bottom? Try clicking just the next arrow.
That's what I'm doing.
Maybe you can go to beginning of slideshow if it's a beginning, and then go to the beginning.
That is
and
the
then,
beginning.
okay. Are you sure you have enough gas?
Yeah. There it goes.
There you go.
All right. I have a breakdown lane already. It's amazing. I mean, I've gotten 5 seconds in and it's falling apart. Well, that's the way it goes. So anyway, to get back to where I was a brief minute ago, custom culture is a very specific car culture. It involves modifying 2 very distinctive kinds of cars. One for speed, which is mainly hot rods, and one for appearance, which is mainly customs. It began in California in the 30s. It spread across the country and it flourished into the early 60s, where it went into a sort of dark age period. As far as hot rods are concerned, you have a few models that are frequently hot rodded. You have Model Ts, Model As, 32 to 35 Fords, some Chevys and other models, but very few. And all body styles were modified and rodded, sedans, coupes, roadsters, pickups. Customs is different. They're American production cars as well. These were built between 36 and 63, mostly Fords, Chevys, and Mercs. All American makes were modified, but not many 4-doors and very few station wagons. Another aspect of custom culture that you can't forget is its connection with teen culture in the 50s, rock and roll, clothing, language, and so forth. The next question is, why California? And I think the answers to that are fairly obvious. You have the weather. California, Southern California especially, is a place where you could ride around in a fenderless, topless roadster 300+ days a year. It was also a place where you could find a rust-free old car for $10, $15 in the 30s and make it the basis of your hot rod. So that was a very important element in terms of creating a custom culture. But even more important, I think, is the fact that Southern California was close to the dry lakes area, Southern California, Muroc, El Mirage, Harper, where hot rodders could take their cars out onto this wide expanse of dry lake bed and take their cars as fast as they could go. And if you look at the picture, you can see almost all the roadsters are pretty much set up the same way. Fenderless, oftentimes without windshields, you know, heading out onto this open expanse where you tried, at least initially, to break 100 miles an hour, and then eventually faster and faster and faster, until you wind up years later at Bonneville with people breaking the sound barrier on land. But what happens if you can't get to the lakes? It's a hike. It's it's basically a day's trip, and you want to test out your hot rod. Well, Southern California in the 30s and 40s had actually very accommodating streets. There were wide streets, well paved, often straight, and so two hot rodders getting together on a street, inevitably you had a street race. And this is the source of a lot of the hot rod menace idea for the hot rodders. You had them, being singled out as sort of, again, outlaws. But drag racing, as this kind of racing became known very quickly, spread. I have to stop just for a second. I got a cat. Another, I had a cat in trouble. So anyway, drag racing, because there weren't dry lakes in Pennsylvania, dry lakes in Massachusetts, or dry lake beds in Iowa, drag racing began to dominate. And especially when drag racing moved off the street onto abandoned airfields, other facilities, designated areas, and then even more so when the NHRA was formed in 1951, and drag racing went from being an illegal activity to a recognized sport. I would just point out, and this picture has always amazed me at the top of, the only protective equipment that these drivers were wearing were goggles. I think one might be wearing a seatbelt, the other I don't think is, but it was wide open then until the NHRA came in with rules and so forth. But what you have evolving as a result of the interest in racing and getting hot rods to be as high performing as they possibly could be, was a look, an aesthetic, which involved basically stripping a car of all excess, and even stuff that we might consider essential, like headlights, windshields, fenders, hoods, to minimize the weight. Taking off the hood exposed the engine. and suddenly the engine becomes a focus of attention. So as you can see from this early rod, the engine becomes a focal point, and so that objects like carburetors, exhaust pipes, manifolds, and so forth receive attention that they don't receive in an ordinary car. Early cars were hot rods were almost entirely home built. There were no or very few professional builders who worked on hot rods. The builders were fairly young. Some of them were still in high school when they started manufacturing their own speed equipment. These were functional, not particularly beautiful cars, often unfinished, but they worked and they were very powerful. A hot rod like this one from the 40s, 1947, is a model for today's rat rods. There are a lot of the current generation looking back and wanting to make authentic hot rods look to these rather than the perfect hot rods as their models. But a lot of the veterans who returned after the war and who had missed their hot rods and had spent a lot of the war talking about hot rods and doing plans for what they were going to do with their car, were no longer satisfied with just a fast car. They wanted something that was going to be perfect. And the next three rods represent the sort of epitome of what that post-war style, the style which continues to be influential today, came to be. This is probably the most celebrated hot rod in hot rod history. It's the Doane Spencer 1932 Roadster. It is generally considered the best of the best. It won the first Concours Prize at Pebble Beach. In describing it, here are some of the quotes about the Doane Spencer. It's an icon, it's timeless, it's a high watermark for deuces, the car that started it all, it's perfect. And as Tony Thacker points out, it stands above all the others. It was a performer, it wasn't just a trailer queen, it raced at the lakes. Bruce Meyer, who is a noted collector, restored it before Pebble Beach. This is another quintessential hot rod. This is the Bob McGee 32 Ford Roadster. It was also a performer. It's a highboy style like the Doane Spencer. So it's kicked up in the rear. It has a little bit of a California rake. All the surfaces now, unlike those early rough rods, these are finished, it's polished. Every aspect of the car is attended to, underneath, inside, outside. This was also a recognized hot rod and was actually picked over the Doane Spencer, I think maybe because it's red, for a stamp in 2014. This is slightly different style. This is what's called a track nose Roadster. It's from, again, late 40s, early 50s, based on track racing, quarter mile track races. I mean, it turned 142 miles an hour. It's pretty impressive in 1952. But they weren't on, you know, the Roadster is the 32 deuce Roadster is the hot rod. There's no doubt about it. Contrary to the Beach Boys and Little Deuce Coupe, when you think of hot rod, you think of Roadster. But there were other styles in California in the 50s that were very influential. One was Norm Grabowski's Kooky Car, which was a mashup of a Model T and a Model A with a Cadillac engine. It had a Model A pickup bed that was shortened. The whole frame was shortened by 20 inches. But what really made this car famous was it appeared on TV. A character, Ed Kooky Burns, as he played Kooky, lend me your comb, on 77 Sunset Strip, became, for any kid who loved cars, became the star of that show. You would watch the beginning for Kooky to drive into a parking lot, 30 seconds. And then you would wait, hoping for another 30-second shot of this car. And it set a whole, developed a whole new kind of hot rod. Not all hot rods were Roadsters or T-types. Neil East had a full fendered 32 Ford. It was a very fine car. The weird story on this, he bought it as a teenager for $75. He was going to turn it into a Roadster. So he took a hacksaw, cut the hood, the roof off, decided he didn't like it, and welded it back on when he was like 18 years old. And then he and his father put an Oldsmobile engine in it. By the late 50s, there were also important rods on the East Coast. These are two, Andy Cass's Jersey Gem, and Fred Steele is actually from the Boston area in his Deuce Roadster. One of the differences between East Coast and West Coast is one is the predominance of coupes on the East Coast for obvious reasons, weather again, but the opposite kind of weather. And but the other thing that's always surprised me in a way is that the East Coast like channeled rods rather than highboy. So rather than being lifted up, the bodies were dropped over the frame. So they became lower. And so you're almost always see chopped and channeled on an East Coast rod. To get back to the culture again, in the 50s, especially, youth and outlaw culture were almost synonymous, and gangs especially helped define what youth culture was. So you had motorcycle gangs, urban street gangs, hot rod gangs, and they were all treated sort of the same way by Hollywood, even though they were quite different. And this is what Tony Thacker says Hollywood didn't get it, because hot rodders were only interested in cars. And the outlaw aspect had mostly to do with car offenses, street racing, equipment problems. Their cars were too low, they were too loud, they were missing essential equipment. And so they were traffic tickets, not, rumbles and street fights and things like that. Although occasionally there were something would happen. But the clubs, as they preferred to call them, were much more interested in changing the image of hot rodders than they were in becoming one percenters like the Hells Angels. They would run reliability runs, safety checks, road service. They would hand out courtesy cards when they would fix somebody's flat on the highway or something like that. But the outlaw image persisted regardless of all this public relations they were doing. So that's sort of a very brief sort of survey of hot rods and how hot rods changed and developed over a period. Now I'd like to talk about customs, and it seems that customs offer some different possibilities in terms of understanding a kind of this subculture. Because rods are basically conservative. The standard form of a hot rod is pretty much stayed the same for almost 75 years. You know, there are minor variations and so forth. We've seen a couple, but it's a form that is really very solid. And there are still people building versions of the Bob McGee Roadster and the Doane Spencer Roadster today. But with customs, you have something that's closer to what we might call an art period or an art movement. And I've taken some of these ideas from Morse Peckham, this idea of stylistic dynamism, that there are, when we look at a period like the Renaissance, for example, we see how styles, forms, techniques, subjects evolve over time, and some emerge and some fade away and so forth. So you have like the early Renaissance and the high Renaissance and the late Renaissance, and then it's sort of moving into mannerism. Well, you have a similar thing happen with customs. And you also have the idea that virtuosity is important. So you have innovators, masters, diluters that are all part of creating a kind of cultural moment. And the other thing that Peckham and Pound talk about is that bad art has to be possible for you to have legitimate art, because you have to have something to measure it. And I nominate this car at the bottom of the page as what happens when customizing goes wrong. This is not a work of art. Well, it is, but it's a bad work of art. So if we look at the evolution of the custom in custom culture, what we find is this would be the equivalent of the early Renaissance, and the Giotto would be Harry Westergaard. And he developed a basic vocabulary that separates California customizing, and that's how it was known then, as California customizing. You had filling in of seams, you had chopped tops, removing metal from the top, lowering the top, giving it a much sleeker look. It was really based on the streamlined aesthetic of the 30s, teardrop tail lights, and teardrop is also associated with streamlining. And you can see the same pattern sort of repeated, the teardrop skirts, the vertical grill, the filled seams, the chopped top. I mean, here's an odd choice. They took a convertible and built a hard metal removable top on this 39 Ford. And here's another one of this early style Jack Calori's Ford, which has recently won the coupe, the early custom class at Pebble Beach. Bruce Meyer was instrumental in getting hot rods and customs recognized as legitimate artworks comparable to the classic, you know, the Duesenbergs and the Auburns and the Cords and things like that, that used to get all the attention at Pebble Beach. So you have this really definitive style of that Westergaard and Dick Bertolucci developed out of Sacramento. But a man by the name of George Barris worked with Westergaard, and he moved to Southern California at the end of the 40s and brought the Westergaard techniques, the Westergaard look to Southern California. And at this moment, it was a fortuitous moment for Barris and for customizing, because by 1949, you had the first post-war new models. You had there was a delay of 3 years getting Detroit back up to snuff and to produce models that were genuinely new. And what those models did was create a whole new possibility in terms of raw material for customizing. Fat fender cars, like the ones we just saw from Westergaard, have very limited possibilities just because of the way the bodies are. And the fat fender look continued in 46, 47, and 48. But in 49, you had a new, I guess, palette to work with. And what the customizers began to do is to create what I call collage. They would look at a Chevy and say, I can use that grille. I like those taillights on that Pontiac. I would prefer that side trim on a from a Buick. And you have this new aesthetic emerging of creating, through a kind of collage technique, a car that is better looking than the original. But there are levels of customizing that come in, because customizing now is becoming, through magazines, movies, TV, rock and roll, more widespread. And not everybody can do the kinds of things that a George Barris can do, or later a Gene Winfield can do. So you have levels of customizing. The lowest level, or the least modified car, is the mild custom. And this is a car that just has few things done. Nose, the chrome is taken off the hood, taken off the deck. It's lowered a little bit, maybe some accessories added, but it's essentially the same as the original car. You know, and if you can see from, this is the car that James Dean rode in Rebel Without a Cause. Here it is in a stock form. Not all that different. Then you go to the next level up, and that's called the semi-custom. And here you can do a lot more. You can change the lines a lot more. You can French the headlights. Here they're add molded grill shell, Chrysler grill bars, Pontiac front bumper, Plymouth hubcaps, DeSoto side trim, and you create something that looks quite different from the original. But the epitome of the custom is the full radical custom. And what that does is it takes all the things of the semi-custom, changing the headlights, the taillights, molding the grille and so forth, and it adds major body modifications, channeling, dropping the body over the frame, sectioning, removing metal from the middle of the body and putting it back together, and chopping, cutting metal out of the roof and dropping it down. And here is what I would consider the sort of equivalent of the Doane Spencer Roadster, and that's Bob Hirohata's 51 Merc. And it is more than just a collection of odd parts. If you look at the lines of this car, this to me represents artistic thinking, not mechanical thinking. Although there's a lot of mechanical ability in terms of the cutting and weld. I mean, a top chop is an extraordinarily complicated thing to do. But if you look at what they took was the straight line of the coupe over here and made it almost like a hard top, and then repeated the line with the side trim, and then repeated the same line with the hood, with the side scoop near the brakes, which is functional to cool the brakes. You have extended fenders so that the hood line and the car line mirror each other. And then it's painted this extraordinary, in 1952, these colors had to have been amazing. There's 30 coats of lacquer on this car, hand rubbed, right? So this again is looking at a kind of perfection, but it did more than that. This car is important because it began to spread the word that these cars actually existed. And Cross Country in a Custom was in an article in Rodden Custom, and he actually drove it from Southern California to Indianapolis to a car show where he won Best in Show. But here's the odd thing about this article and other pictures that were taken. Just as an aside, but this is a clone at the top of the Hirohata Merc. It was long believed that the original Hirohata had disappeared and it was destroyed, and no one knew where it was. And so Jack Walker got Doug Thompson to recreate at an enormous expense the version of the Hirohata Merc. But notice the color. Do those colors look alike? No. They worked from photographs and magazines that were faded because they were looking 50 years later. So when Jim McNeil suddenly revealed that he had the Hirohata Merc in pieces in a garage for 40 years, they discovered this was the actual color on the bottom. And some people wouldn't believe it because they had grown used to the Jack Walker version on the top, which is actually a very faint green. It doesn't look like it here. Okay, this is another collage masterpiece by Gene Winfield. It's a 56 Chevy. Many different cars contribute. This is a car that's very important to me because it's from my hometown, Stamford. I watched it being built. Again, many parts: Buick side trim, Packard taillights, Chevy bumper guard, DeSoto grill, Oldsmobile engine. It's a remarkable piece of I think collage art. But as I mentioned, with stylistic dynamism, cars don't stay the same. The styles change. And by the mid 50s to the end of this golden era, you have what I called Expressionism. And this is going way beyond just collection of parts. This is about reimagining what the car looks like. So the 54 Chevy on the bottom turns into the dream truck on the top. And you see, everything that could be done to this car was done. It was sectioned, it was chopped, it was, the fenders were grafted on with hand-formed fins. The front was completely fabricated. There were no other car parts used. It was made from just metal. This is maybe the one of the more beautiful expressionistic customs. Winfield's Jade Idol, a 56 Mercury with a multicolored fadeaway paint job. Again, it's hard to find anything that wasn't handmade. It was sectioned, the grille is hand formed, the bumper is hand formed. He did form the headlight rims from hubcaps, but we're no longer just replacing parts anymore. And this, I think, gives you a really graphic demonstration of the difference between the first customs on the bottom, which we saw earlier, the Westergaard look, and the expressionistic look. It's basically the same car. But this, the El Matador is sculptured. It's again, it's chopped. it's sections, it's every panel is modified. So we get to a kind of fork in the road, because something happens during about the same time that the expressionistic sculpture is happening, where every aspect, every panel is changed to a shift, and largely through the influence of one man. That's Larry Watson. Paint becomes a way of customizing on its own. Paint was always important to customizers. We saw with the Hirohata Merc, those brilliant colors. You know, it's like seeing Technicolor. It's, you know, like going to Oz. It's going from black and white in Iowa or Kansas to Technicolor movie. And so what we have is using paint and paint motifs become a replacement for metalwork. So here is Dean Jeffries and his crab claw flames. He was noted for flames within flames. Here's a Watson's seaweed flames all over. It's basically a stock Buick. It's a brand new Buick that it's been flamed. And you can see in the lower part a more conventional flames that grew out of flaming, started as a response, you know, from fighter planes in World War II, you know, where they would have the flames coming out of where the engine was. Cars sort of do the same thing. Watson said, no, I'm going to go the whole, and so did Jeffries. Then he shifted from flames to scallops. And if you look at the bottom, just really this ornate paint job of mixing, you know, rose mist and metallic silver in one motif. The body is basically a stock. It's a semi-custom, but it's treated as a full radical. It's seen as something beyond ordinary. And here's other versions. This is paneling, which he invented actually. Candy paint fades when it wasn't stable at first. It would ultraviolet light would cause it to almost turn like muddy until they figured out how to stabilize it. So one of the things he did was he started using what he called paneling to cover up these things and create a whole new design. He's one of the most inventive. When I talked to him when I was working on the book, it was just astounding. He thought about color in the way that painters think about color, just pure color. How can I make a? He would go to the market and say, I want something to look like that pineapple or that apple. So in the end, and now we're at the end, and I hope the customizing sort of ran its course, and so did hot rodding to a certain extent, although to a lesser extent. Builders could no longer support themselves by customizing, partly because you could get a $400 paint job from Larry Watson and not pay $16,000 to Gene Winfield for Jade Idol. But then Detroit started competing with hot rodding, and you started having factory hot rodders, like in '64, the GTO. You had the Mustang coming later on. You had all the pony cars. You had the Road Runners and the Super Bs and all these other cars. And so people could just go in and spend a little extra money and get a hot rod. So builders began to look elsewhere. And you started having show cars, model kit cars, TV cars, and silly cars, which have nothing to do with what custom culture really is, in my view, which is modifying street cars, modifying cars on the street. There are a lot of people who love these cars. They're very collectible, but to me, it marks a a devolution rather than an evolution of customizing and hot rodding. It was sort of like, we're going to imagine the future. This is Dean Jeffries' manta ray. They were successful. They were in movies. They were on TV. They helped keep these guys going. So in that sense, they were a real plus. But as vehicles, to me, they're one-off novelties, as opposed to something that extends our understanding of what a car is and what car beauty is. That's my view. Not everybody feels that way, but these, are they're silly to me. They're clever but silly. And I mean, you make a hot rod out of a toilet and 2 bathtubs is, to me, the definition of silly. So but there is some hope. In 1973, there's a surprise movie by George Lucas, which sort of goes back to the original sort of sense of what car culture was about. And it takes a couple of decades, but there is a renaissance. There is life at the end of the gas crisis and counterculture and vans and dune buggies, and custom culture returns actually bigger than ever in the 80s. And that's it. I'm out of breath, and thank you very much.
Jack, thank you so much. This has been absolutely amazing. Learned a lot. This is so good. I wanted to open up the floor to folks if they wanted to ask questions. You can drop them in the chat. We also don't have that large of an audience. If you want to pop off just for a second and ask a question, be welcome to do so.
Yeah.
So.
Bob Aronson is trying to talk, and I think he's muted.
Yeah, we'll have him go next in just a second, because we do
Okay.
have one here in the chat. And Bob, if you can't get that going, you can type there as well. We got one question. This is actually really interesting because there's some of this happening, not necessarily with cars, but here at Northeastern. So will 3D printing help restart the custom culture? Is that something that is technology being used?
I can't see why not. I mean, in terms of especially creating parts, I mean, one of the things that happened in between what I call the collage period and the expressionistic period is people decided they wanted to make their own grill, and so they would go to hardware stores and they would hunt around and they would get doorknobs and drawer pulls and stuff. Well, with a 3D printer, you could just let your imagination go. You don't have to go to Home Depot. You could sit down, make drawings, and then produce pieces that you could use, in a car. So I don't see any reason why not. I mean, I think one of the odd things about custom culture that's different from other car cultures in a way is that, here, when the Hirohata Merc was built, it was a year old. Now people 70 years later are building 51 Mercs. It's the same, they're still working on the same vocabulary, the same cars, the same era, and it's the only ones who are sort of in the same world as the original customizers are the tuners who work for, with 10-year-old Corollas and Honda Civics and Subaru WRXs and things like that, and work on those and modify those. And I mean, I saw there's a Honda Civic with a 4-cylinder engine that develops 1,500 horsepower.
Wow.
Jennifer, thank you for your note there about that and showing it to your dad who has experience in this field. Bob, did you want to jump in with the question there?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of a Wilder Up. It's on, I think, History Channel, and it features Steve Darnell in Las Vegas, and he just takes bits and pieces and just out of his head without even drawings, just does amazing rat rods. And it's like, it's on like 2-3 times a week, and you just go, holy shit, this is really amazing stuff. Where does he fit in your pantheon in terms of like, where would you slot him in terms of his contribution to the field?
I would say he's closer. I don't know, you know the phrase outsider artist?
Yeah.
You know, I would see him more as an outsider artist, someone who, you know, an outsider artist is someone who paints or does sculpture, but it's odd, it's somehow different. It's in some ways cruder, but at the same time just as inventive. But
he's very precise when it comes to like, if he's
absolutely. Absolutely.
And the authenticity of not just but the actual parts of the car and how it's being done, and we really can't do this. We wouldn't honor it properly if we didn't do that.
I am a fan of his as well. And I was just saying it's not a straight line. And one of the things that happened with
but to me he seems like, when you were saying, I would put him in the expressionist. He's not an abstract expressionist, but he certainly is an expressionist. But I would sort of say like a realist expression, because his cars are all street legal.
Of course. It grows out of the rat road, which is a whole other chapter.
Yes.
He's not a strict rat rodder. He's a little bit, that's why the outsider thing came to mind.
Yep.
But we could debate it, you know.
Yep. But you dig it. That's cool.
Oh, absolutely. I like him when he looks at a piece of metal and imagines what it could be. It's brilliant. It reminds me. The idea
when you were talking about like repurposing, like, you know, using Packard headlights and using Chevy grills, and this guy is saying, why don't we use a diesel engine? It's like, what? A diesel engine in a rat? What the hell is that? So he's like, that's almost like his mantra. Let's start with the diesel engine and we'll go from there. But it's like very strange. Yeah.
Is there anyone else has any questions?
I do. I'm wondering if a recording of this meeting will be available that can be forwarded to other people.
Yes, Richard, we will post this bridge version on the YouTube channel that we have. It's available on the alumni website, but also just make a note right here to email that to you when that comes out.
But does Jack get royalties? That's the question. Does he get royalties? It's 1%, 2%. I mean, he has to get something here. Pay for his gas was something. I mean, he gets.
Jack, we do have another. Jack, it looks like. Sorry to interrupt there, Bob. But Jack, we do have another question here in the chat. Does the bathtub rod use exhaust pipes as if a running board? It said it seems novel, even if it's not practical.
Oh. Yeah, I mean, I think everything about it is novel. I don't dispute the novelty of it. I have a problem, and with what became about merchandising as opposed to art. You know, it's like let's think of you know, there are outhouse rods. There were, you know, it's like, you know, any oddball thing that we could sell to a model company that an 8-year-old kid would find exciting. And that to me is what happened. It was starting to go to not 8 to 12-year-old kids became the market for a lot of these cars, because they could make more with a Revell kit than they could with the car. And so that, I have issues. I don't condemn them. I just don't find them all that interesting. I would much rather look at the Jade Idol than a bathtub rod.
All right, we've got one more question here. So if people want to learn more, what are some resources, books, shows, podcasts? Where can they turn?
Well, there's one source there.
Yes.
But I think there's some great, if you're interested in the history, there's a great site called Kustomrama, which is a guy out of Sweden who is obsessed with American hot rodding. And it's interesting, there are Europeans who drive 53 Chevys, and in England and in Sweden, also on the other side of the world, in Australia and New Zealand, there is the custom culture lives and it thrives. So Kustomrama, there are, for custom cars, Pat Ganal's book on custom cars is a, probably the definitive book just on that history. There's the heroes of hot rodding, the birth of hot rodding. There's a ton of books that are about the origins at the lakes and on the streets of Southern California. But if you just, basically go to Google or go to Amazon and just, put in custom cars and hot rodding and stuff, you'll get a ton of things. There's also YouTube has thousands of videos. You have Motor Trend TV, Discovery Channel, History Channel, all have shows that are related to hot rodding and customizing. So, there's plenty of resources out there. There's some, some are better than others. But you pick and choose and you'll find things that resonate with you.
Got one more coming in here.
Okay.
This is from Brian. He says, Jack, what was the catalyst in your interest, your expertise? I guess, how did you get interested and started in this yourself?
Well, there's two stages to that. One is the interest was just being a kid in in the early 50s. And the first car that really had an effect on me, I wrote a poem about it. It's called Ferrante's Ford. I was downtown in Stamford, Connecticut, and I heard this sound, and I'd never heard a sound like it. And it was dual exhausts, 50 Ford with the souped up flathead engine. And he turned the corner, and I could see him go away. And I just said, I had never seen anything like that in my life. I just became, and then I started looking for those kinds of cars. And then Karcher's brought his car home, that blue car that I talked about, and I watched it being built. And I just said, this is way beyond me. And then I got my Chevy, which was, I think Joe made it much more finished than it really was, but it was my 53 Chevy Nervous. But then if you jump ahead, like maybe 30 years, I was at a sort of stall in my career. I wasn't doing much with fiction. My poetry, I didn't care about. And what I did was I spun around in my office and I said, where I stop is going to be my next project. So I just spun around, and what I came to was a bunch of old car magazines that I had saved. And I said, that's it. Fate has decided. And that I spent 5 years working on the book. And I began to see, because at the time I was teaching at an art school, I began to see the connections that I might not have seen if I had been teaching at Drexel, where I started. That the thinking, the kind of thing that Bob was talking about in terms of ways of thinking about material, ways of thinking about form, ways of thinking about color, were no different when I talked to Larry Watson than when I talked to my colleagues at UArts. So that's how it is. That's the short version of it.
That's fantastic, Jack. And just want to say thank you for, on behalf of all of us here today and Northeastern here in the Alumni Relations Office. Thank you for your presentation. It's been truly fantastic having you on today. Thank you all for attending today. Thank you, Joe, for doing our introduction. I'm going to make one quick plug to everyone attending today as part of our next event in the NU at Noon series. 12 days from now at noon on Monday, the 29th, coming after the Thanksgiving weekend, we'll have a presentation with some professors here at Northeastern, 3 different professors from different departments. The presentation's called "What Would It Take to Vaccinate the World Against COVID-19?" We'll be talking about vaccine technology, supply chain management, accessibility, some things like that. So we hope that you can join us. I'm going to drop that link in the chat, leave that there for just a moment. If people would like to click it, you can also find that information on our website. And if you've attended NU at Noon events in the past, you likely received an email about that this week. But thank you all again so much for joining us. We really appreciate you having it on. And we hope that you can join us for another event sometime soon.
And thank to all of you for attending, and I really appreciate your being here.
Thanks so much, Jack. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you all again very soon.